Hello everyone, Dicko here with another kick-ass walkthrough. This is episode 5 of a multi-episode series covering an introduction to rigging. In the previous video, we blocked out our FK and IK bones and then followed through with creating the IK controls for our rig. In this video, we're going to connect our deformation bones to our FK and IK controls. And then we're going to create a driver that will allow us to switch between the FK and IK constraints. So let's just jump right in. Okay, so how do we get this bone chain to work in tandem between our FK bone chain and our IK bone chain? Well, we use constraints again. In this case, we use something called a transform constraint. And what a transform constraint is basically copying the rotation, scale, and location of our FK or IK bone chains and duplicating it onto our original deformation bone chain. So to do that, it's the same way as making that IK constraint. We select our control, and then we select the corresponding deformation bone that needs to be affected, and push Control Shift C. We get that dialog box again, but instead of clicking on IK, we select Copy Transforms. And look at what happens when we do that. Once we go down the bone chain. It won't affect really, it is affecting it, but it won't affect it until that parent has been constrained as well. So if this thing wasn't connected to our base here, so if I change it to an offset parent-child relationship, it will just snap straight to this bone. But look what happens when I start manipulating now. It copies exactly the motion of our IK controls. Yep, see how that's working? Pretty cool, huh? And now we just have to do the same thing again, but with the FK controls. So look what happens now when I add the FK constraints. Same process. I add a copy transform constraint for the FK. And as you can see, it makes a second constraint on the same bone. Let's do the same thing here. And again, once more. And now, look what happens when I control the FK. Whee! It's doing the same thing. It's inheriting the transforms of our FK controls. Interestingly though, look what happens when I try to manipulate the IK now. Nothing is happening. Nothing's happening at all. And why is that? Well, it's because the FK constraints that we've given to this bone chain has overwritten the original constraint. The influence is overrunning the influence of our original constraint. So look what happens when I turn off the influence of that FK constraint. The IK now works again, whilst the FK isn't affecting our deformation bones at all. And that essentially means that we need to create a switch to turn off and turn on the influence of that second constraint, so it no longer affects the deformation bones when we want to. So how do we do that? We do that with what is called a driver. And a driver is basically a mathematical equation, in this case in Blender, that determines when things are turned off and turned on. So to do that, we can make a switch. And as you can see in my original rig that we had in the preview before we started here, I made a switch here. Just a simple little switch. And we'll do the same thing here. We're just going to create a new joint that determines when the FK and IK influence the deformation of our original deformation bones. So let's get started on that one. And after that, we're pretty much good to go to create the controls for this rig. Alright, so I'm going to create a new bone in edit mode. So let me just reset the 3D cursor so it's generated in place. I'm going to turn on snapping again, make sure it's got increment turned on again, and then I'm going to snap it to the next part of the grid so I know that it's absolutely perfect, because I want it to actually travel between one unit and another unit, essentially, so I get a perfect sort of easy way of mathematically determining the distance between the switch. Alright, we're going to give this the name control FK to IK FK IK switch .001. Alright, so to do that we need to create a driver for these objects here, but first we need to constrain this control as well. And as if you've watched my second video on what I constitute as having a good rig, this is where the exception comes into place, where we add a constraint to the control. So in this case, I want to add a limit location constraint onto this control. I want to turn on minimum Y, Z as having 0 complete limitation, so they can't move in either Y or Z. I want to turn on for transform, because look what happens when I still might not be able to transform in the Y or the Z. So have a look at this, but it's still creating movement in the location transform. So I want to actually make sure it's set to for transform so it doesn't affect my translations in that case. With the minimum X and maximum X, I want to give it the number -1, no, 0, and then +1. Switch it to local space. So switch it to local space and then you'll be able to move it into place. So we want it to go from 0 to 1. And that will give us a switch value of 0 to 1. So from 0% to 100% influence of either the FK or IK. So let's just put that back to 0. And now that that's sorted, we can actually start to work on creating that driver. So because the FK bone chain is influencing our deformation bone chain last, we want to turn the driver on and off using that constraint. So to do that, we just simply go right click on our constraint where it has the influence and then select add driver. And as you can see, it pops up a little dialog box and it looks a little bit intimidating, but once you get used to it, it's actually quite powerful. So in this case, we need to create a driver that's being driven by our control here. And as you can see, that fucking dialog box disappears when you float away from it. So to get that back, you can either delete the driver. No, you can open up the driver editor here, or by edit the driver by bringing up that pop-up again, or you can actually open up the driver editor. And I prefer using the driver editor still because it gives me a better representation of what's going on. So I'm just going to open up the driver editor. I'm actually going to create a new window on the side here. Switch over to driver editor here, and then open up that side panel here. And as you can see, because I've added the driver here, it's actually created this little graph that's representing the influence. Alright, so if we switch over to the driver tab here on the side in that graph editor, you'll see that we haven't assigned any controls to that driver. So let's do that now. So same as our pole vector thing, we need to actually assign it to the rig. So we assign it to that robot arm rig. And then we have to tell the driver which bone we want to have influence that driver. So in this case, we want our bone here to influence the FK-IK switch of our deformation. So we actually just have to paste in the control FK-IK switch name, and then we switch it to, we make sure it's being influenced by the X location of our bone, because we've created the bone in that world space, and if we turn on axes, you can see that when we slide it from 0 to 1, it's sliding from 0 to 1 in the x-axis. If you wanted to use the driver in y or z, you'd have to limit your location in a different way here from 0 to 1 in the y or the z, and then you'd have to make sure that the driver is being driven by that x or y location or z location according to the way that you build your rig. All right, I'm just going to switch that to local space as well, just to make things clear for me. Local space means that it's transforming relative to this bone here rather than to the world, and I find that to be quite reliable with regards to certain drivers. All right, so we need to actually add that driver again to these 3 bones here. So to do that, let's just copy the driver and paste it into our other constraints. Now do this slowly, by the way, because I find that Blender tends to crash sometimes if you do it too quickly, because you are actually adding calculations to the rig, and it tends to get bogged down a little bit if you add too many at the same time. Now, I just want to describe what's going on here with this driver beyond just what we've added in the input. So normally with Blender, it's actually creating a mathematical equation of sorts to determine when things are being switched on and switched off. And this is done through an expression. And the expression determines how this control influences the rate in which the driver is turning on or turning off something. So inside the driver, you have a denotion of VAR or VAR, variance, and you actually use that as part of an equation if you have more complicated drivers. So if we make another rig in the future, we'll get into more detail about how that works, but basically you use that value use that denotion inside an expression to create more complicated drivers. And as you can see, it actually creates a graph from 0 to 1 based on the value that we've been given to the driver. Alright, so let's have a go at this. So right now, our driver influence is still set to 1. If we manipulate our FK right now, it's working. And if we turn it off, let's see what happens. And as you can see, nothing has happened yet. And the reason for this is because our expression has added a value of 1 on top of our base value of 1 in the translation. So actually, when we are translating from 0 to 1, it's actually adding another value of 1 on top of that because of that expression. So we actually have to remove that plus 1. So let's do that now. On all those drivers. So we select our drivers, we just remove that plus 1. And now you'll see, again, nothing has really happened. Everything still has a value of 1 on the bones here, but that's because our bone has been translated by 1 in its local space. But look at what happens when we bring it back to 0. It's going to be influenced by our IK control. Again, let's move that again. From 0 to 1, you can see that transition happening. The influence of this bone in its translation is affecting the value of its influence. So let's have a look at that. If I bring it halfway to 0.55, it's going to have the exact same value of influence in that driver. And this is where that flexibility comes from. So now all we need to do to get this ready for creating controls is to bring these bones back these bones back into place to lie within the same space of our bones here, of our deformation bones. So to do that, we're going to jump back into edit mode, go into our orthographic view. We're going to select our bones chains like this. Make sure you've got the bottom bone selected last. We're going to change it from bounding box center to active element, and we're going to turn on snapping again, and we're going to snap that back to where they're meant to be. Make sure you select that base bone first, at the end, sorry, and then bring that back. Alright. And as you can see, because we've already translated it, if we translate those now, make sure we select the right control. And as you can see, this is why we have to create controls to begin with, because if you're just selecting bones, it's a pain in the fucking ass. Alright. If I select that IK and move it around. What's going on here? Oh yeah, snapping. Turn off snapping. Yeah, it's working pretty well. Everything is following suit. And if we move our base bone here and rotate that around, everything is working in tandem. It's all working together. And if we switch off our IK back to FK, it's working pretty good. And now, there's one thing that I find to be a pet peeve, and that's the order in which we've named our actual control. Because we've actually set the zero space to be, the zero value to be our IK, I want to rename our bone to be IK to FK. And that's actually quite important in little ways, because it actually helps clarify that to start off with, that this control is meant to be IK by default. And as you can see, it's working pretty good. And if we just reset our pose, you can see, and to reset, by the way, is Alt R or Alt G or Alt S. You can see it's actually quite hard to see what's going on now, because we've got all these overlapping bones. And to fix that, we can do a few things. One, we need to move our bones, our different bone structures into different bone layers. And the second thing is to create controls. So we'll create the controls in the next tutorial, but I'll quickly show you how to move bones into a separate bone layer. So to do that, select your control hand. I'm just going to move our bones so we can see what's going on. Alright, let's select our FK bones, and then we'll go to our armature object data, and up here you can see bone layers. And to move this bone layer to another bone layer here, we just push M on the keyboard, we get a little prompt, and we just choose the layer that we want. In this case, I'm just going to put it next door here. And as you can see, it's disappeared. It's not actually been deleted, it's just hidden. But if we push shift and select in the layers panel here, it comes back. And again, I want to select my, in this case I'm going to select all the deformation stuff, and I'm going to move that to another layer just so I can see where the IK is going. And as you can see, the IK control is now in that original layer, and if I select the layer that on the bottom here, it's showing my deformation bones here. So now I can see exactly where all my bones are without getting too frustrated. And just for the sake of consistency, I will move all my deformation bones, even though they're not being enacted by any other controls. I will move those all to the same deformation layer, just to keep things consistent. And now there's one last thing I need to do, and that is to parent this control to our global control here at the bottom. So in this case, the very base control here, I'm going to bring that there. And then I'm just going to Control P, parent that with the keep offset. And that's it. That's all we need to do right now for that portion of the video, of the rig. And In the next tutorial, we'll get to making those controls and finalizing the rig, and after that, you'll be able to animate with it. So until then, catches.